Hello, my name is NiCole Buchanan, and I'm here to talk to you today about research biases and epistemic exclusion and how they stymie our efforts towards diversity and inclusion. Michelle Fine described academia as an increasingly gated community where exclusivity is the rule, noting that there is a creeping hegemony of publications and grants that creates a very limited definition of what is considered rigorous, valid research, methodology, topics, or populations to study. Our science has to begin to embrace the richness and the nuance that's involved in centering social justice, intersectionality, and diversity, and creating space for these topics to exist within the scholars, research, and theory that we study. Integrating our science with these tenets demands that we hone our skills and our tools in order to make our vision of science a reality. We have to implement policies, practices, and methodologies that promote social justice and invite scholars that represent the world out there so that we can generate scholarship that is relevant out there in the real world. But of course, this is not an easy task. Today, I will discuss why academia has resisted these frameworks, highlight the biases and blind spots that hinder our ability to support and recognize more diverse research and the scholars that produce it, and offer strategies for increasing their integration in research, practice, and STEM more broadly. I believe a shift such as that I'm proposing will increase diverse scholars in the field, transform the nature and questions asked within our research, the manner in which we conduct our clinical interventions, and the relevance of our science for the populations we serve. A diverse faculty body is a critical component of educational excellence and research innovation. Demographic diversity is associated with intellectual and creative advancements that surpass those of homogeneous groups. Faculty gender and racial heterogeneity increases the diversity of thinking that's necessary for advancing our research innovation and contributing to global scholarship. Diverse research teams are associated with more innovative solutions to problems, and the solutions that influence the field as measured by increased citations of patents and papers that are produced by diverse teams. The inclusion of women faculty and faculty of color expands science by asking new questions, developing new subfields, and applying established knowledge in new ways and with new populations, such as research documenting heart attack survival disparities between men and women. When diverse teams are involved, their work often appeals to a broader mass of the population, which increases the chance of adaptation and adoption, and reduces that research to practice lag, which can be as long as 17 years. Faculty diversity increases student diversity, and it increases academic success as measured by things like graduation rates and student achievement. And students that are taught by diverse faculty demonstrate greater cognitive flexibility, higher order thinking, problem-solving abilities, and communication skills. I realize that many of you are already successful in your scholarly endeavors with teams that are fairly homogeneous. So why should you care about increasing team diversity and research diversity? Well, one, diversity just leads to better science. We see this across every possible discipline, and the cost of the absence of diversity is actually quite costly. For example, we miss things like there being differences in response to treatment, such as the research on women and heart health. That can lead to actual deaths and morbidity. And when we have research that doesn't apply to the broad population, what we're actually saying is that our findings only apply to a small segment of the population. And institutions face considerable cost to their reputation by lacking diversity. It becomes clear to outsiders that this may not be a space that is welcoming to people like me, and therefore they do not consider those institutions or working in those labs. And our lack of diversity continues to restrict our pipeline so that we don't have the diverse talent now or coming through to the future that was possible if we had opened up diversity earlier. And although we don't typically think about it this way, diversity in our teams simply is an issue of justice. We serve the populations that are funding our research via their tax dollars. But when we don't have teams or results that represent those people that are paying those taxes, then we are actually not doing our best science and not reflecting the needs of those that are funding our science. If we know all of this about diversity being beneficial, then why is it so hard to actually achieve it? Perhaps the primary concern is that faculty lack diversity. Compared to their representation in the US, Asians and non-Hispanic whites are overrepresented among full-time university faculty, whereas Black, Latinx, and Native Americans are underrepresented. And although women's representation among full-time faculty has increased by almost 12% over the last 20 years, where they now equate to approximately 45% of full-time faculty, there has been very little change among faculty of color. The increases range from as small as 0.1% for Native American faculty to 2% for Latinx faculty, with the exception of Asian faculty significantly increasing from being only 5% of faculty to 10% over the last 20 years. These disparities increase as faculty move through the academic ranks, such that the percentage of assistant to full professors decreases by up to 50% among underrepresented minority faculty, or sometimes I'll refer to them as URM faculty. So this would be Black, Latinx, and Native American faculty that are underrepresented. And the decreases change by up to 19% for women faculty. Notably, URM and gender disparities are exacerbated in STEM fields, with women filling only 19 to 31%, underrepresented minority faculty filling as little as 0.1 to 5.1% of STEM faculty positions. And those that cross identities are notably absent, with only 0.8% of full professors being both Black and female. The lack of diversity has a number of negative consequences. For example, most scholars have had very little exposure to the kinds of high-quality, relevant research related to diverse populations. This lack of exposure to the topic means that they're unprepared to discuss, let alone research, issues related to diversity and social justice. This increases resistance to the topics and reluctance to engage those who discuss such issues. These prejudices create a cognitive dissonance, which is resolved by disparaging research on those topics, despite having very little exposure to it, something we'll discuss as epistemic exclusion. Perhaps most problematic is the tendency to also disparage the people who force us to contend with these issues via their research or their membership in marginalized social groups. Resistance to these topics creates a hostile environment for scholars of color, especially if they do diversity-related or social justice-related research. Such an environment marginalizes them as individuals and devalues their work and their contribution. As a result, many consider leaving the field. Further, the absence of mid-career and senior faculty of color and the relative lack of diversity-related research and training alienates students at all levels. Undergraduate and graduate students of color self-select out of fields where they're not represented and move into those disciplines that have faculty and research that reflect them, their research, and their interests. At a minimum, if we want to better recruit and retain diverse students and faculty, the field has to embrace their presence, their population foci, and diversity and social justice-related scholarship. The slow change for URM faculty and the modest change for women faculty suggests that existing efforts have had limited success in diversifying STEM. Turnover among those groups is high, and efforts to retain them are undermined by institutional and interpersonal challenges that disproportionately target and impact these faculty, such as a lack of belonging, ostracism, incivility, marginalization, isolation, and tokenism. My team and I propose that epistemic exclusion is a form of scholarly devaluation that is often unexamined and associated with negative work perceptions and worse work and psychological outcomes among women and faculty of color. Before we do a deep dive into epistemic exclusion, or you'll also hear me refer to it as EE, here are some examples of certain types of scholarship that reflect the center of a discipline and then the contrasting scholarship that is perceived as being on the margins. So often work in the center of a discipline reflects only the discipline's norms, whereas work on the margins is more likely to be interdisciplinary, for example. Work in the center of a discipline might focus on basic processes or be more theoretical, whereas work on the margins is often applied. Work in the center might be quantitative and exclude qualitative methodology or focus on biological factors rather than behavioral factors. Traditional work prioritizes generalizable results that cut across the average population versus findings that might be specific to a population of interest. They also focus on dominant group members versus marginalized groups and concerns. Research in the center purports to be untouched by the values and bias that an individual may have, whereas research that is political and deeply personal is often marginalized. Traditional research pretends that the researcher is a neutral conduit for post-positive truth with a capital T, and any potential bias is controlled by the research process itself. This is in opposition to marginalizing research that is central to the life of the researcher, that is personal, and where their bias is acknowledged because the research itself is embedded in factors that make it impossible to be neutral. In fact, under these circumstances, neutrality could reflect pathology in the face of human suffering. My colleagues and I propose that epistemic exclusion works as an academic gatekeeping process. Those in power have been successful by engaging in traditional or mainstream scholarship, which yields them epistemic power. Those with epistemic power establish and maintain disciplinary norms. Epistemic exclusion functions to reify dominant and traditional academic endeavors by creating methods of scholarly assessment and recognition that privilege mainstream research and researchers. And because the existing system is one that has made them successful and powerful, they have very little incentive to change it, which disparately harms those whose research is constrained to the margins. As a result, it limits the proliferation of marginalized research and the dissemination of those findings. Epistemic exclusion is a form of scholarly devaluation rooted in invisible biases about disciplines and individual identities that end up being built into our systems of evaluation. The theory of epistemic exclusion asserts that seemingly neutral performance standards actually reflect disciplinary biases about the characteristics of good scholarship that then center mainstream research and researchers. We theorize that this occurs as a result of two related biases. The first is there's prejudice towards faculty of color that is rooted in negative stereotypes about their intelligence and or their foreignness. But this is unacceptable. This bias is not directly expressed. Instead, it's expressed via the devaluation of their non-traditional scholarship. The second form of bias reflects the assumption that any legitimate scholarship already follows disciplinary norms, things like objectivity, researcher neutrality. It should be bias-free and focuses on dominant groups and concerns that are relevant to dominant group members. It's important to note that their social position, also referred to as situatedness, and their outsider within status increases the likelihood that marginalized group members will have a different lived experience from dominant group members, and this often influences their scholarly interests and make it more likely that they will conduct research that is outside of disciplinary norms. But being outside of these disciplinary norms also means that they're more likely to be deemed as illegitimate scholars. It's also important to point out that the second form of bias can actually function as cover for the first. For example, when someone has implicit biases, they can express their prejudice through the rejection of the non-traditional scholarship that marginalized group members are more likely to engage in. Rather than saying these faculty are not competent, faculty of color are not competent, they could fall back on perceived problems with certain types of scholarship, and this kind of critique is socially acceptable in academia. This will allow them to pretend that the fact that marginalized faculty happen to engage in that body of work or that scholarship, it's just coincidence. These disciplinary biases about the boundaries of quality scholarship are coupled with the identity-based biases regarding marginalized groups that thwart fair and objective evaluation processes. Given that faculty merit is determined by systems of evaluation, these forms of bias disproportionately impact the hiring, advancement, and promotion of women and faculty of color, and act as barriers to inclusion and equity to the full scholarly development of our various research fields. In our study, we found that faculty of color talked about two ways in which epistemic exclusion, or EE, occurred. First, epistemic exclusion operated informally. Faculty accomplishments were often unrecognized, faculty lacked legitimacy, and their work was perceived as being incomprehensible. Nobody could understand what the research was or why it would be important. Informal processes are not codified within university procedures and hierarchies, but nonetheless devalued their scholarship and cast them as illegitimate as scholars. In the interest of time, we're going to focus on the formal processes. Formal hierarchies are the ways in which institutions established a system of disciplinary norms denoting what scholarship and types of academic engagement were valuable, important, or significant. Epistemic exclusion operated through formal hierarchies of evaluation that universities used to make merit, promotion, and tenure decisions. In particular, some types of scholarship were evaluated as lower in quality based on the topic, for example, focusing on marginalized groups or social problems, or perhaps medical concerns that are more common among a particular marginalized group. Sometimes it focused on the method, perhaps they're more likely to be qualitative, or the publication outlet, for example, focusing on top-tier journals or presses, or whether the research was grant-funded. And there are many examples of epistemic exclusion that is embedded in these formal hierarchies. For example, faculty described that the standards around scholarship and performance requirements were often unclear or changeable. For example, participants in our study felt that higher standards were applied to them as compared to their white colleagues, such that once they achieved the standard, it would shapeshift, so they were once again defined as missing the bar. There were particular challenges in how outside rubrics were used as validation of research quality, such as federally funded grant-based research being conferred higher value, or the size of one's grants then being used to scale the value of the research and the scholar conducting the research. All of this is despite recent evidence that research grants from people of color are less likely to have a biological emphasis, which reduced the likelihood of being funded, and that even when they did focus on biological processes, grants submitted by people of color were less likely to receive NIH funding compared to white scholars. And there were several ways in which the publication outlets were subjected to epistemic exclusion. For example, another way that research quality was assessed was by the perceived quality of the publication outlet. And this was determined by criteria such as an impact factor, rejection rate, or perceived prestige. However, impact factors were never intended to serve as an assessment of the quality of an individual paper. And impact factors are heavily influenced by subscribership, which is then heavily influenced by the extent to which its content appeals to a wide mainstream audience. So journals with the highest impact factors tend not to focus on social justice, marginalized populations, or related issues, and they do not accept many papers a year with these kinds of foci. As a result, research with a smaller body of scholars is more likely to be published in journals that focus on those topics rather than in broad appeal journals. Our research shows that the consequences of epistemic exclusion are substantial for the individuals experiencing it, as well as for the institution as a whole. At the individual level, participants described consequences for their research work and their career progression. For example, to avoid epistemic exclusion, they sometimes limited or changed the scope of their scholarship to try to fit disciplinary norms. This, of course, resulted in them being less productive and feeling less engaged with their research. Epistemic exclusion also had consequences for promotion and tenure decisions when the work the faculty did was perceived as not good enough, or if the research was presented in biased ways because it was on the margins. And participants directly tied value to their pay, noting that when one isn't valued as a scholar, one doesn't receive merit pay increases. Finally, participants also talked about institutional consequences of epistemic exclusion. Most significant was the loss of talent through high faculty turnover And some also noted that there were reputational costs to the institution when it's discovered that it is a place that is not supportive of faculty of color. In addition to this, we suggest that gatekeeping produces disciplinary inertia, such that things continue to be done in the same ways and innovation occurs more slowly. There's a loss of potential research innovation, novel questions, new applications and adaptations, limited dissemination, reduced proliferation, and adaptation of interventions. And this continues the disconnect between the ivory tower, the populations we serve, and the public that funds our work. This begs the question of what we can and should do to change the status of science as it pertains to research and inclusion. First and foremost, we have to address the climate concerns that have a disproportionate negative impact on diverse faculty. For example, targets of workplace bullying, mistreatment, and exclusion are not random. 80% of Black respondents, 73% of women, and 46% of LGBT faculty admit to being bullied at work. These behaviors are more common for older workers and for workers that are 35 years of age and younger, and this can be particularly costly because these are people that tend to be more mobile and are more likely to leave. It's also socializing younger colleagues that success at this institution requires that you engage in bad behavior. It's important to note that individuals that are targeted tend to be outside of the hegemonic dominant structure. They have less power and are more likely to experience bullying, so the costs and the burdens are disproportionately built on the backs of those that are already most vulnerable. Some of the individual consequences that were noted are increased physical health problems, decreased life expectancy, suicidal ideation, decreased work productivity and problem-solving abilities, a decreased commitment to work, and disengagement from one's research. And organizations have significant consequences for workplace mistreatment. Over $64 billion was lost to workplace bullying last year and every year. This includes lost time and productivity, individuals disengaging and withdrawing from students and from research, people retiring prematurely. And in fact, when you calculate time that is lost for either coping with, reacting to, or strategizing how to deal with bullying, as well as the associated shame and fear, you see that on average, nearly 4 hours a week are spent coping with these things and strategizing, which translates into 195 hours per year, or a full 5 weeks per year. If we look at this with someone who has a salary of $50,000, that would mean that just under $10,000 of their salary is dedicated to bullying behaviors alone. Faculty turnover costs approximately 150% of their annual salary. This includes re-advertising their position, interviewing, recruitment, retraining, lost productivity for those doing the search, and for the employee prior to leaving, and overtime to people that are having to cover the work that that employee had done in the past. So this means that employee making $50,000 will now cost $75,000 to replace. I'll also note that this doesn't include the fact that over time, the average salary of new faculty tends to go up, so you may have to pay a new salary person more to replace that person. Transforming the culture of science requires a change in who is in the field. We must significantly increase the diversity of the pipeline of undergraduate and graduate student trainees if we hope to impact the field and the eventual faculty force. This also requires that we increase faculty diversity at all levels currently, as well as retain them. We have a leaky pipeline with challenges at entry for people of color, especially those who represent intersecting marginal identities, such as those that are first generation, low income, or queer women of color. Being underrepresented in the field, having your research foci marginalized and devalued, and learning about the negative experience marginalized faculty have as scholars leads doctoral candidates to pursue careers outside of academia, and difficulties in retaining them if they do embark on an academic career. Thus, diversifying science will require an understanding of the unique stressors multiply marginalized students and faculty face, particularly the barriers to having their research embraced and recognized. To create change, we must also transform the standards for research, publications, and grants within science. For the field to move beyond diversity as pathology paradigms, we need to make sure that the more substantive study of variables like gender, social class, race, ethnicity, and their intersections become the gold standard of good science. Perhaps the fastest way to force this shift is via requirements for grants and publications. In 2017, NIH released policy guidelines positing that it is important that we establish whether our interventions work differently across groups and require investigators to ensure that men, women, and members of ethnic minority groups are included in research, unless doing so would be inappropriate, harmful, or there's ample evidence that there are no differences between the groups. We assert that such a requirement is important, not just to ensure that these groups benefit from the research, but also because research that fails to be inclusive lacks rigor and increases iatrogenic intervention effects, which disproportionately then impacts marginalized people. This shift in research standards requires that publication venues also require inclusion. At a minimum, publication venues must require that authors report relevant demographic features of their samples and define the extent to which their findings can be generalized across groups. Recent issues of high-impact journals in the field continue to publish scientific studies without providing relevant demographic information, at a minimum, things like race, ethnicity, and gender about the sample. Or they're not providing data on how the findings apply across demographic groups within the sample. And this is the highest ranking journals in our field, things like the American Psychologist, Journal of Abnormal Behavior, Neuroscience. Failure to report demographic data and failure to analyze and report data as it applies across groups is bad science. And one could argue that such practices render findings useless because we do not know to whom the results apply, nor can we engage in a more substantive discussion of the importance of such variables and their impact on research findings. Given that influential journals in the field still allow such practices, we are a long way from seeing published studies that consistently report data for intersecting categories, such as how particular findings might apply to Black women as opposed to Latinx women, Black men, or white women. Yet this is absolutely a direction that we must begin to. In moving forward, it's also important that we understand the role and the impact of epistemic exclusion across all levels of the educational spectrum. Considering education, we teach graduate students these disciplinary norms. This then influences what knowledge students are exposed to and can influence whether students are encouraged or discouraged to pursue particular areas of study. In hiring, job ads may be written in such a way that they exclude people who work on the margins. It can also impact which applications are even considered, particularly if the scholarly area is deemed as being within the scope of what a unit is looking for or without. And it is particularly impactful for promotion. This was what our data most reflected, partially because our participants were faculty. Here we saw that epistemic exclusion was a barrier to the promotion of faculty of color, which could then lead to turnover, but also the problem of women and faculty of color disproportionately being stuck at associate rank. To return to our premise, we see epistemic exclusion as a form of gatekeeping in which those that are working in the disciplinary centers bar entry to those working in the disciplinary margins. We note that white men are more often in the center, whereas women and people of color are more often at the margins, so this gatekeeping prevents greater diversification of academia. To reduce epistemic exclusion, one strategy is to encourage departments or search committees to have explicit conversations about disciplinary values and norms before moving forward with searches and promotion and tenure decisions. This past fall, the University of Michigan began including epistemic exclusion training as part of their training workshops for search committee members on reducing bias. A major step would be also shifting our thinking about value and how the work that is on the margins contributes to value. Reconceptualizing work at the disciplinary margins as cross-cutting and cutting edge rather than marginal. Along with shifting our ways of thinking about valued scholarship, change would require a shift in the policies and the practices to reflect valuing that work. This could take the form of rethinking appropriate metrics, such as valuing niche or topical journals as much as journals in the mainstream, or reducing our reliance on external metrics like grants and journal impact factors to tell us what scholarship is important and makes a contribution. Finally, it's helpful to reduce the defensiveness of scholars working in the center who may hear this as a call to push them out. I believe that novel approaches do not detract from contributions of such work, and there's room for people to be at the same table and to shape the field. Academia can no longer afford to dismiss the critical ways in which multiple social group identities intersect to inform individual experiences, well-being, intervention, and research. Furthermore, research, practice, and theory are limited to the extent that they reduce broadening our work and actively embracing theories that properly contextualize the lives of those our work is intended to serve. Change as proposed here will be a radical departure from our norm as a field, but it is desperately needed for a field to remain relevant for the U.S. of today and tomorrow, and for our increasingly diverse global society. Scholarship in our field demands both critical inquiry and critical praxis. And as a field, we stand at a fork in the road. One path continues status quo, rarely including thoughtful analysis of diversity, intersectionality, and social justice in its day-to-day practices, and perpetuating an environment that is often hostile, alienating to individuals who embody diverse and multiply marginalized identities, and rejecting of the critical research done in these domains. An alternative path embraces the richness and nuance involved in centering social justice, intersectionality, and diversity, and creating space for these topics to exist within scholars, theory, and research. This path will increase diverse scholars in the field, which will transform the nature and questions asked within our research, the manner in which we conduct interventions, and the relevance of our research for the populations we serve. That is how we radicalize science. If you're interested in learning more about our work, these are some related studies and papers published on these topics. And this is my amazing group of collaborators. As you can see, we are a diverse group of people, both in the fields that we represent, gender and race. It's an amazing interdisciplinary collaborative team. We'd like to give a heartfelt thank you to our generous funders, without whom we could not have done this work. If you have any additional questions or considerations after our Q&A today, feel free to contact me in any of the following locations. And if you're interested in any of the papers that I listed earlier, they are available at my ResearchGate profile. Feel free to download articles and read more about the work we're doing.